Welcome to the Diversity of Diversity. I'm Kerri Thomsen, Associate Director of Literacy at Room to Read.
My name is Titus Kazungu, Associate Director for Literacy Programs in Africa. We will be talking about the power of children's storybooks in fostering inclusive communities.
Room to Read believes that world change starts with educated children. We support children in underserved communities around the world through our programs in literacy and girls' education. We empower them to create a better future for themselves and their families. Since our founding in 2000, Room to Read has benefited more than 23 million children and has worked in 20 countries around the world. We'll be focusing today on our literacy program. We work with educators to support literacy instruction through training and instructional materials. We partner with schools to establish and manage children's libraries, and we publish, purchase, and distribute children's books in local languages. Room to Read has published 4,777 original and adapted children's books in 43 local languages as of the end of 2020. Room to Read works with authors and illustrators from the communities in which we work to publish books that children will love. We provide capacity building workshops and mentorship to support both new and veteran book creators. Imagine that you are at one of our workshops and you're illustrating a book. It's about a child's first visit to the doctor's office. One of the first exercises that illustrators do is to draw the characters. So grab a piece of paper and a pen, and we're going to do some drawing. Don't worry if you're not an artist, just picture the character that you want and do your best to draw it. We're going to start by drawing the doctor. We'll give you 1 minute to just make a quick sketch. I hope you've had a chance to draw your doctor. Now draw the nurse in the doctor's office. We'll give you another minute to make a quick sketch of that. Okay, please wrap up your sketches, and we're going to talk a little bit about them. We're sorry that we can't be with you today to talk about your illustrations together, but we have some reflection that we'd like to do. Illustrators often imagine characters as matching the dominant race, religion, or culture of that country. For example, in the United States, the majority of books have white characters, and you're more likely to read a story with animals as the main character than people who are Black, Latinx, Asian, or Native American. Gender norms can also lead to males and females only being cast in certain roles. So thinking about the doctor that you drew, was your doctor female, a person with a disability, white, Black, Middle Eastern, Latinx, Asian or Pacific Islander, from an indigenous tribe, or from a minority religion. To give you something to reflect on with your own results, we ran an experiment with colleagues at Room to Read. Without telling them that we were looking at the issue of diversity, we asked them to draw a doctor and a nurse. You can see the results for the doctors here. One interesting finding is that the percentage of male and female doctors was very balanced, and this is across 3 regions where we did this activity, the US, Asia, and Africa. The focus on that balance, we wonder if there's some relation to the fact that Room to Read has a girls' education program and that gender equity is always on our minds. But you'll see that also most regions drew their characters as the racial majority in that region. And while the genders were very diverse, very few characters were drawn wearing anything that would signal their religious affiliation, and no one had disabilities. These are a few of the illustrations that we received. Would you illustrate your doctor differently, given what we've just talked about?
Now we will also take a moment and look at the nurse you drew. Was your nurse female? Was that nurse a person with disability, white, black, Middle Eastern, Latinx, Asian or Pacific Islander, from an indigenous tribe, from any minority religion? From the same survey we did, we noticed that there were very few male nurses, and that also basically shows the kind of environment that people are and the influence they have that has on them. From the survey we conducted, there were more nurses that were female from the African and the South Asia teams than the US team. For example, the US team had 23% of nurses who were white compared to 12% black, 8% Latinx, 7% Asian, and in the 3 groups surveyed, there were no indigenous tribes that were indicated as being part of the nurses. It is also worth noting that both the African, the South Asian, and the US-based teams had no nurses with disability. These are some of the examples that we got from the teams. And as you can see, there are a few things to note from the artist. I was quite impressed by 2 who indicated specifically that men can be nurses too. And the other one there who is also male on the left-hand side. Something worth noting also, which we found very interesting, especially from Africa, was the skin tone or skin color of some of the nurses as well as some of the doctors. All these illustrations from Africa had a tone which looked more fairer than the normal that we know for Africans, which is usually slightly darker. So we note that the issue of colorism is a big issue in children's book, especially both in Asia and also in the context of Africa. And the impact of this matter is huge, especially on ladies who choose to sometimes make their skins more fairer than they are. So, having talked about this, how different would your nurse have been if you had more information around diversity? Now, let's look at some results from the US based on a survey that was done in 2019. And we noticed that most of the main characters in children's literature in the US were white, and another huge number was actual animal characters. Interestingly, there were more characters, animal characters, at 29.2% compared to Black, African American, the Native, Latinx, Asian Americans, and the Pacific Islanders combined at 26.95. So if you combine all those, you notice that there were more animal characters than even those other groups combined. Another interesting thing to note is that for characters with disability or those who are part of the LGBTQ plus were only 3.4 and 3.1 respectively. Finally, I think it's important also to note that when you compare this data from 2018 to 2019, there's a slight improvement. However, we still see that there are still very many white characters compared to the other groups that were recorded.
We aim for diversity and inclusivity in all that we do. Diversity is about the individual or group and the differences that you'll see in a society between different groups. Inclusion is about increasing the meaningful participation of all groups and reducing exclusionary factors. We know that books give children new ways of looking at the world and themselves, helping them to develop as global citizens. Our books are written by local authors and illustrators representing races and cultures all over the world. We strive to include other differences, such as disabilities and ways of living. Stories can connect and inspire us all, regardless of where we come from. Let's delve a bit deeper into the importance of diversity and inclusion. They're issues of social justice and human rights. All people have the same rights and deserve to be treated with respect. Books are an ideal way to familiarize young children with their community and the world. As new readers resonate with the stories they read, they're able to better understand themselves and develop traits that will help them, such as resilience, empathy, and resolve, and they begin to question harmful stereotypes. The brain treats fictional characters similar to real-life experiences, so books provide a space for learning about and accepting differences. Rudin Sims Bishop's seminal essay, Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors, provides us with a framework to consider diversity in books. A mirror story includes characters, settings, traditions, and story problems that are similar to the people, settings, traditions, and problems that readers know and experience in their own lives. Mirror stories reflect our lives and situations that are familiar to us. Children's reading experience of mirror stories therefore becomes a mean of self-affirmation. A window story is one that's set in a different location or culture than the one in which the reader lives. The text and illustrations describe and show characters, settings, traditions, and story problems that may be unfamiliar to readers. They can show us new and different realities and worlds, thus expanding our imagination. These books may offer views of the world that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange, but window stories help the reader to understand and appreciate the otherness as depicted in multiculturalism, which is helpful in finding healthy connections with other human beings. These books can also be helpful in learning empathy and perspective. A mirror to one child might be a window to another, but whether it's a mirror or a window, stories can connect us. And we like to have both mirrors and windows available for children to read.
There are many traits, identities, and diversities that can be shown in children's books. In this next section, we'll share some of those. Beginning with settings, in children's books, setting is about time and places. We can show different places so that through the settings we show, we can affirm children, but also show them windows to other places. For example, we can show rural areas versus urban areas. We can show villages versus towns. We could also show different areas like the oceans, rivers, farms, forests. And through this, we are able to both show mirrors to the children as well as windows for them. Diverse books should also address children's socioeconomic status as well as their spirituality and religions. Representing socioeconomic status, and different religions, like these ones we are sharing in these books, provides children with both mirrors and windows experiences as well. I will highlight around 3 stories from our collection of books. Kara's Kite is a story about a girl who has no money to buy a kite during the kite season. In this story, we see how the illustrator infuses diversity by making the girl a Muslim with a religious head covering. Even though the story is not about religion, that integration means young Muslim girls will see themselves in the books, which affirms them and their heritage. Creating diverse books oftentimes should aim at reducing the disadvantages caused by different intersections like gender and religion. Another story that I want to share is V's special gift. For example, in this story, it's in the midst of a challenge in a community, and the girl V spends the whole day queuing for rations of rice. By the end of the day, the rice is finished. The villagers choose to share the rice with V, who goes home and gets a rice meal with her family. Clearly, you can see that family is poor because they have to actually live on rations of free rice. The final story I want to share is a story called Party Without a Party. The main character lives in a middle-class family where they have access to computers and internet, which enables her to have a virtual party with her friends. If you compare this with V's special gift, you can clearly see that the representation there of a low-resourced community as well as a middle-class community comes into play. World over, many children's books represent gender in a very stereotypical manner. For example, you will find that many instances, doctors and engineers tend to be men, while nurses and teachers tend to be women. We need to, therefore, do books for children that help them to be what they want to be. For example, in these stories from Room to Read books, we see a girl who wants to play soccer and is able to do well in that, or the girl who wants to use a bulldozer, and that is her wish. One interesting story is where a hen wants to crow like a rooster, and while others are really discouraging her, she continues to do that until she's able to do it. Sometimes men also can do roles that are typically female. For example, the boy who prepares a meal for the whole family, or the father who plaits the daughter's hair. Sometimes also it's okay for boys to desire things that are, to desire to do things that are typically female, like we see in one of the stories where a boy wants to copy the sister in everything that she does. When gender roles and existing stereotypes are flipped or challenged through diverse literature, children then are encouraged to begin to pursue different interests and are affirmed in what they want to be.
The literature defines counter storytelling as a method of telling the stories of those people whose experiences are not often told. By showing the perspective of the marginalized, it sends the message that all people's cultures matter. Ethnicity and culture are reflected in books through clothes, food, festivals and holidays, activities, or arts and crafts. Seeing their traditions in a book is an exciting and affirming experience for children. The book may focus on culture, or it might be subtly incorporated and visible only to those in the know. One way to encourage ethnic and cultural diversity in titles is to use diverse authors and illustrators, including those from minority communities in the country. We also consider the target audience and using common cultural ties to build relatability. Representation of children of different abilities is important for many reasons. attitudes conveyed in children's literature shape the attitudes that pervade our society and vice versa. Children's literature is a form of media for children, and when characters with disabilities are portrayed negatively, these attitudes become a part of children's collective consciousness. The scarcity of texts, including characters with disabilities, may even be contributing to the lack of reading success among students with disabilities, even those with average or above average IQs, as it can be frustrating not to have a book where they can see themselves. Many books treat disabilities as an afterthought, with token characters placed in a crowd. While characters with disabilities should be present everywhere, including in crowds, it's important for them to also take center stage. Some books make the character's disability the defining factor of the book. These books can show the strengths and resilience of these characters. An example of that we have on this slide is the boy who's blind, who's in a book called I Like Your Way, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. Equally important are books where the character's disability isn't mentioned at all. It's a part of who they are, just like the color of their hair. And we'll talk a bit more about that as well with the story of The Suitcase, featuring an albino boy. Books can even use animals to convey messages of acceptance, strength, and power when the animal with a difference finds their place in society, such as the book with the bird who cannot sing. It's important in books with characters with disabilities to be sure not to rely on stereotypes or other offensive beliefs. Diverse lifestyles should be depicted in favorable light and not represented as the problem. Their success should not rely on doing things a certain way, but should celebrate their natural abilities as valuable.
In this section, we will explore some selected diverse books. The first book we want to reflect on is Rescue the Princess. In this story from Vietnam, we have a very strong character who is female, a princess who needs to be rescued from an evil tower by a knight. The knight has several challenges that the princess helps him to finally rescue her from the evil tower. It's the story that challenges social norms and stereotypes because the princess ends up saving the knight in most of the occasions instead of the other way around, which is usually the norm. The second story is Ya's Backyard Jungle. It is a story about a young second generation Montagnard American girl who lives with her younger sister, her hardworking parents, and her grandparents who take care of her and her sister while her parents are at work. Now, I think the critical issue here is to note that it's a minority community in Vietnam that is not always represented in books, and the story brings out issues around their heritage, hearing some of the stories around food, around different aspects of their culture. And this book will actually be translated into Jarai language. And so they'll be able to have books in their language as well, which really is an excellent thing.
In the story, The Suitcase from South Africa, a boy wants to participate in a dance competition, but he has no costume. After attempts to get one fails, he finds an old suitcase that contains clothes from his grandfather. His grandmother adjusts them for him, and he dances in the competition. Significantly, the story never mentions that he is albino. In many parts of Africa, albinism is poorly understood, and albino individuals are stereotyped, ostracized, and even killed. Presenting this child as someone whose goals and feelings readers can identify with, but who happens to have albinism, may make a lasting impact on the attitudes of children readers. This story also represents a specific culture. Readers can tell he is Zulu from his costume, and a family type, where he's being raised by his grandmother. This intersectionality reminds us that people identify in multiple ways, sometimes compounding their advantages or disadvantages in society. The book I Like Your Way from Indonesia is about two children on their way to a birthday party. Rory wants to guide Ronnie, who is blind. But Ronnie repeatedly tells her, "No need worry, I know the way," while demonstrating how he uses his other senses to find his way. Unlike in the Suitcase, where the character's difference was not mentioned, I Like Your Way focuses on Ronnie's blindness. But it's represented not as a disadvantage, but almost as a superpower. He's the hero of his story and succeeds on his own and in his own way, impressing his sighted friend along the way.
Data coming out of Cooperative Children's Book Center of 2020 shows that there are very few books by minority communities. So it's one thing to have books about the communities, but it's another to have books by the communities. Children need to not only see themselves in books, but they also need to see that the writers and illustrators are people who look and sound like them. When we talk about own voices, it is going beyond the diversity of the characters and the settings and the topics that we talk about to beginning to focus about the diversity of the authors, illustrators, and sometimes even the publishers themselves. Why is this important? It is important because when we write books or when people write books in their own voices, there's a way in which those kind of books reduce misconceptions and the stereotypes and other harmful portrayals that people have had about different communities. It also amplifies stories of people who either have been marginalized or excluded over a period of time or historically. But also it results to extra cultural nuances and authority that comes with the people lived on experience. When someone tells you their own story, then there's an authority that comes out of that. As Chimamanda Adichie also talks about the single story, when we write in our own voices, it disrupts that single story. And finally, it gives voice to the voiceless, because some of these communities, as we said, like the Jarai, there are very few books published in that language. And so when people are able now to begin to get books written in those languages in minority communities, then they get a voice that typically was not there in the first time. So how has Room to Read addressed diversity in books? I'm sure now we've given you several examples, but we want to highlight a few of the ways in which we have tried to address the issue of diversity in children's books. Number one is that we train local authors and illustrators. In all the communities where we work, we want to ensure that the writers of our books and those who illustrate them are people who are from that community, people who speak the languages that we work in. We seek out stories about marginalized communities, like we already talked about the Syrian refugees, the Jarai community, and many other communities we work across the globe. We also encourage that writers develop diverse characters in their stories. We try as much as possible to celebrate local cultures, whether it's through their ceremonies or different kinds of foods. We want to ensure that the books we develop celebrate those cultures where we work. And finally, we also work at adapting books across cultures. As we talked about mirrors and windows, this is one of the ways as we version stories from one language to another language, people are able to see themselves in some of these stories, but also they're able to learn about other people's cultures, tradition, and even unique settings as well.
Not all types of diversity and inclusivity can be present in every storybook. However, an overall library collection should aim to contain books that represent all types of diversity so that children who access these storybooks can be exposed to both validating mirror stories that reflect their identities and circumstances, as well as window stories that introduce them to worlds and lives beyond their own cultures and countries. To find mirror and window stories for the children in your life, We invite you to go to literacycloud.org to find a selection of room to read stories from around the world. Thank you for joining us today.